They made it possible for them to receive those things. In some communities, they call it receiving stolen goods, man. But again, we're talking about and dedicating his show to the Honorable Walter P. Carter. That's what we're talking about today. Nothing else. So we get back into your mayor tomorrow. We get back into the issues of police brutality and them beating, of course, the little 14-year-old boy. This the same police department tell you they got a do not pursue policy. And more people been killed because they have a do not pursue policy because they being pursued. We'll get back into that, I promise you, over the next couple of days. And, of course, going to be joined by my brother and friend, Chairman Fred Hampton Jr. We'll be talking about Chi-Town, the Chirac, and what's happening in Chicago, because they clearly have Chicago on their radar screen with the social engineering of what they're pushing and getting ready to release in Chicago to see if it'll work there. And if it'll work there, it'll work here, because Baltimore, like Chicago, at a time when blacks were getting opposition as far as mayors in Chicago, you had the dailies sitting in Chicago saying this still going to be a white man town. And you had the likes of Willie Don Schaefer and some of those racists that was backing him, even though they claimed to be Jews and Italians and others, the Irv Covens, if I can keep it real, the Jack Polikovs and the Greeks and others. But they still said this is going to be a white man's town. So we had to wait till, 87? 87 before we finally got a black man? And then, of course, he was just black in color, but not black in his mind. And then, of course, came the opportunists in 99 in Martin O'Malley. That's why I said 71 was a pivotal year. 99 was a pivotal year. Again, in terms of what happened with Lawrence Bell. And we have to be mature enough as the people look back at that, analyze where we went wrong, how we went wrong, what did we do to go wrong, because we're facing the same enemies that the Honorable Walter P. Carter was facing then. Except they're a little more overt and covert. Some of them not even overt and covert with what they're doing to you today. They coming right at it, saying, yeah, we did it. What you going to do about it? Yeah, we moved you up out of so-and-so and so-and-so. We took your money and we're going to build Harbor Point. What you going to do about it? That's gangster. We taking your money and building Harbor Point while we taking your mom and them homes. What you going to do about it? You want to sugarcoat it. Well, Muhammad, it's not as bad as you think it is. It's not as bad. You know, they giving us something. What do you have, man? In the words of Al Jolson, you got plenty of nothing, and maybe nothing's plenty for you. Nothing's plenty for you. But let me come to the line. I'll take your thoughts, questions, comments, man, as we're talking about the Honorable Walter P. Carter. And this is the Don Lemon Free Zone. Do not call up in here asking me about that old fresh squeezed lemon lime Don Lemon. I'm going to deal with him in due time. Al Sharpton, Martin King III, and others that want you now to come march on a Saturday when the buildings in Washington, D.C. will be empty. But again, man, you know you far off when your leadership today is a former FBI informant, current FBI informant in Al Sharpton, man, keeping it real, with a conch up in his head. And he got nerve to tell you that you want to come to Washington on a Saturday, as opposed to saying, no. Let's do it on the 28th, which would be a Wednesday, and then really see what kind of effect you would have on this country. Let's call for the boycott, as the masses have been, of Tropicana and products produced in Florida. Florida Citrus, Florida Natural, Minute Maid, Gatorade. Let's call for that boycott. And if you don't hear them saying that, then you know you are like night and day, man. You are far away from them, and they are far away from you. If you don't hear them saying that and then doing that, when you got the National Bar Association black lawyers in Orlando or Miami as I speak, the National Association of Black Journalists in Florida next week, NAACP fresh out of Florida, they want to tell you about coming to Washington and we need to get things right. Well, here was an opportunity for their asses to make things right by taking an example and using economic withdrawal from the state of Florida. But they say we can't break a lease. Well, go break a leg if your ass can't break a lease. Break a leg then, Ben Jealous. Break a leg, Al Sharpton. Break a leg, head of the National Bar Association. Break a leg, head of the National Black Journalists. Break something. Break something if you ain't willing to break a lease to stand for the least of in this country. So watch what they say and then watch what they do even more, man. Let me go to this clip. Speaking of Dr. King, before I come to the line. May not even open the lines today. Let me go to this clip of Dr. King, only about 5 minutes from the historic March on Washington, man. Speaking of that, and what Dr. King talked about in terms of where we were, in terms of the country then. And ask yourself, how much further have we become? I'm only going to give you about 5 minutes of it. So listen to this message. Then we coming back in, opening up the lines, take your thoughts on the Honorable Walter P. Carter at 410-761-1592. But since he led this large delegation of 15,000 to the historic March on Washington in 19 63, then here's our opportunity just to have an attitude of gratitude to say thank you, thank you, thank you. So with that, let me go to this clip, and we'll be back with more of the State of Sin.
At this time, I have the honor to present to you the moral leader of our nation. I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we've come to cash this check A check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summit of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But that is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. And they have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children